Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, where we invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. So I'm John Plotz, unfortunately flying solo today without the wit, wisdom, and wonder that is Elizabeth Ferry. Our topic is the re-education of race, though an alternative title might be How Equality Got Hijacked by Educability, Plasticity, and what that has to do with Jewishness. So this has certainly been a Recall This Book season for delving into problems of racial and cultural classification. We began back in December with a three-part series on Indian and Israeli ethno-nationalism, violent majorities, although I wrote vile majorities here, but yes, violent majorities. And recently, Elizabeth and I spoke with our wonderful Brandeis colleague, Duran Wallace, about his new book, The Culture Trap, which looks at how racialized schooling norms operate in the UK and the US comparatively. Today, though, I'm delighted to take a step back in time to the heady post-World War II days when racism was recognized as one of the key causes of Nazi atrocities, and when, as a result, race, understood as a sociological category masquerading as a deep biological truth, seemed like, for a moment, it might be on its way out. So here to tell that story is the fantastic Sonali Thakkar, assistant professor of English at NYU. So hi, Sonali, welcome.
Hi, John. Hi, thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you. So, Sonali has just published The Re-Education of Race, Jewishness and the Politics of Anti-Racism in Post-Colonial Thought at Stanford 2023, late 2023. So I first read her marvelous 2020 social text article on the same topic a few months ago. And as a result, I cold called her looking for the manuscript of the book. And it's something I've never done before, and I'm really glad I did. The book taught me so much about an era that I have science fiction related reasons for obsessing about, that fluid post-war moment when the ideological and intellectual assumptions of the Cold War had not quite curdled. And so that liquidity, that uncurdled space you've shown us, had an unexpected set of arguments that raged. And particularly, you have a crucial central text, which I will let you tell us about, that you focus on. So in the Recall This Book tradition, Sonali, can I welcome you and ask you just to begin by sharing the central discovery and key claims or interventions of your book, however you want to focus that.
Sure. Okay, so let me give you the kind of one sentence version of this, which is that the book is trying to think through how attempts to redefine race at the United Nations and especially at UNESCO in the early post-World War II period contributed to making ideas about Jewishness and Jewish difference really central to anti and post-colonial discourse. So let me kind of unpack what I mean by this. So as you noted, there's a kind of central text, or what I think of as like the heart of the story, which is UNESCO's 1950 statement on race. And this statement was put together by, at the time, leading figures in the social sciences and the social sciences, including people like Claude Levi-Strauss, Ashley Montagu, Morris Ginsburg, E. Franklin Frazier. And it had what I think of as a kind of, it was an epical statement insofar as it really sought to end scientific racism and to try to redefine race in explicitly anti-racist terms. So what's important about this statement is it kind of emerges at the same moment that the UN is really trying to think about what a new world order looks like, a remade international order. And what is important to the story is that this is a moment when I think race and racism become central to international politics, really for the first time in a kind of new way. And there's an understanding at the UN that race and racism have sort of shattered the old political order and maybe are threatening the new one that is being attempted to that they're trying to create in its wake. So on the one hand, there's a new kind of willingness to disavow and reject race and racism. At the same time, this is still an international order, still kind of constitutively structured, as the political theorist Adam Getachew has sort of put it, by racial hierarchy and unequal integration. So this is still an imperial international order. So part of what I'm interested in here is the way that the delegitimization of race in this early post-war period is running ahead of the delegitimization of imperialism. And what that means, first of all, for these sort of top-down efforts at the UN and UNESCO to produce a kind of anti-racist global pedagogy on the one hand, and at the same time to sort of preserve the imperial status quo, which the UN is in no rush to dismantle. And, as W.E.B. Du Bois puts it in that kind of early post-war moment, this is a new organization that's trying to, on the one hand, quell international aggression, but also perpetuate and even extend imperial hierarchy and imperial control over the third world. So there's that element of it. At the same time, there are anti-colonial thinkers and activists who are eager to make use of these new institutions and of this opening that emerges at this moment to use that delegitimization of race to further their own aspirations, right? Anti-racist aspirations and especially anti-colonial aspirations. So that's kind of the scene that the book begins from.
And I'm so glad, just to pick up that final point. Actually, your earlier point made me want to ask about the League of Nations and earlier efforts to articulate a world order in which anti-racism wasn't even on the table. But just the final point you made about the coexistence of people like Du Bois and just a generally kind of anti-colonialist discourse made me want to kind of thank you for this discussion you had in the book of what you call exclusion, intervention, and entanglement, like a methodological way of thinking about a kind of knotted genealogy where even if people are not explicitly referenced, I'm sure you don't see any footnotes to Du Bois in UNESCO writings, nonetheless, there's a back and forth that can be invisible in the overt language and yet be kind of clearly constitutive of who's arguing with whom.
Right. And I think that relationship of entwinement and interconnectedness speaks to the kind of methodological approach of the book, which is really trying to draw on what Edward Said describes as a kind of contrapuntal method that takes what might at times seem to be these developments, unrelated developments in these separate scenes or developments that don't quite fit together, and to show how actually they're really knotted and intertwined. And I think one of the things that you see in discussions of the UN and decolonization and the role of the UN in decolonization is that often people start that story more around the 1960 mark, when you have many more, formerly colonized nations achieving independence, joining the UN as member states. You have the right to self-determination enshrined in international law. But what I'm trying to say is that even before some of that exists, you are already seeing at the level of cultural influence and cultural engagement, these connections. And we're seeing the ways that anti-colonial thinkers were already looking to the United Nations. And I'm arguing to this UNESCO project, which really has not been taken up in post-colonial literary studies, right? The significance of this project as a kind of intertext, as a site of engagement has not been taken up. So I'm trying to make the argument that this is, I think, part of a larger project in post-colonial studies at the moment to move away from what Gary Wilder has called a kind of methodological nationalism that's always thinking about the nation state formation and national self-determination as the horizon. His work, Adam Getachu's work, instead is trying to think about these networks and then the kind of key role of some of these international organizations in mediating these claims and as a site of engagement. So to really try to think about how these separate scenes are connected and actually constitute one story.
That's great. So can you just talk us in the nuts and bolts, like the kind of smoking gun for you is this 1950 UNESCO statement on race. Can you talk about how it came to be, the cast of characters you mentioned already briefly, these four folks who were important for you, but tell us about that document.
Yes. Okay. So UNESCO is the first sort of agency of the UN. 1945, it kind of officially comes into existence in 1946, and they have their first general conference. And from the beginning, I spend part of the book looking closely at their first general conference and the kind of minutes from that conference, and their real preoccupation with the way that how racism threatens humanity, in a sense, and the need to kind of constitute a new set of values, a new set of principles on which a new world can be based. So their Nazism and Nazi anti-Semitism are the rhetorical frame for this project. They are invoked at every turn. At the same time, there is a recognition that this is a global problem, that the dimensions are global, and that colonialism's genocidal violence, right? The destruction of cultures in the name of racial superiority has contributed to this and must be reconfigured. At the same time, this is not an anti-colonial project. And it is in the kind of tension between those two positions that I think a lot of the conceptual interest of this statement lies. So in this early moment, they're really trying to think, how do we re-educate humanity? How do we re-educate the child? Is racism even something educable? They're kind of haunted by the thought that racism is just, something they're not going to be able to get beyond. And then at the very same moment, just a little later in 1948, as the UN's, the Human Rights Drafting Commission is putting together the UDHR, they kind of include race, of course, as one of the grounds on which it's impermissible to discriminate. But they don't have a lot to say about what race is or isn't. They're not trying to define race. And that's the work that the UN's Human Rights Division outsources to UNESCO. So they ask UNESCO to go about putting together some kind of anti-racist pedagogical program. So in 1949, the UNESCO's Division of Social Sciences, which at the time is headed by a Brazilian anthropologist and physician Arthur Ramos, brings together a group of scientists. I named some of them earlier, who meet in Paris and try to draft this statement. And the statement is, my kind of key, the beginnings of the story, because what I'm sort of arguing they do is that it's this kind of key moment when they try to redefine race as malleable and changeable, not fixed, right? Not the old versions of like strict racial taxonomies. Race is this unchangeable thing that just sort of gets passed down from generation to generation. They want to kind of mobilize population genetics. They want to mobilize some of the kind of shifts in that moment that are taking place in biology and genetics. And they want to mobilize the new kind of social scientific claim to be the sort of authoritative discourses of knowledge production about race, and to instead define race as this changeable and malleable thing. And I'm sort of making the case that their key claim is about the plasticity of race. But the claim about plasticity is also coming out of this long tradition, by then, pretty well established, that really begins with sort of Franz Boas in the early 20th century and some of his interlocutors and collaborators, to think about racial form as plastic. So there's also a kind of subtle shift that they're enacting here, where that question of the plasticity of racial form reverberates, but is also sort of universalized and shorn of its like explicit connections to racial form, and actually made this sort of universal property of the human.
So that's totally great. And forgive me if this short circuits the incredible complexity of the word plasticity, but can we connect it directly to the way in which the characteristic stereotypes about Jewishness in Europe from the 19th century on have to do with this chimeric or shape-shifting or metamorphic quality of, quote, the Jew? I feel like it's even there in Marx's The Jewish Question, maybe, so that somehow the plasticity of Jewishness, sometimes aligned with capitalism or the tendency of, modernity to liquefy everything into the cash relationship or whatever, like that becomes an attribute of Jewishness alongside all of those older kind of tribal or, antiquated or primeval conceptions of the Jew as belated. There's also this notion of Jewishness as plastic in its very modernity. Does that figure in there? Or?
It sort of does, but I think what's key here is that when like Boas sort of, mobilizes this language of plasticity, which for him is a discovery, right? He sort of is like very circumspect himself about what it means when he kind of discovers racial plasticities in these studies that he's doing in the kind of 1910s for the U.S. Immigration Commission, which, he looks at immigrants from a number of different places, but he begins with Jewish immigrants to the U.S. And then he kind of goes on in the teens and later to make these claims about the paradigmatic plasticity of Jewishness. And for him, it's a kind of claim that promises liberation from racial taxonomy and from anti-Semitism, to say, hey, people are changeable, and we have to think about racial form as this malleable and plastic quality. We can see it changing within as little as a generation.
There is a way in which there's a sort of scale, right, where plasticity is at one end and then like the rigidity or inflexibility on the other, which I think, if I'm understanding your argument right, you associate with blackness. Is that right?
Right.
So can we talk more about that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So there's this like really interesting moment in the statement where they've done all this work to talk about, genetic populations, they're fluctuating, they're changeable. But then they kind of fall back on like the old taxonomies of like the physical anthropologist. And they sort of say, what do we know about the races that exist at present? Well, there are three major groups of humankind, the Negroid, the Mongoloid, the Caucasoid. But there's every reason to believe that these will change in the future. And these kinds of taxonomies are embalming, which is like just a very interesting language about like the kind of deadening quality of racial taxonomy. The thing they're promising is plasticity will put that back in motion, right? But at the same time, as I'm saying, not everyone is equally plastic. And in Boas's own work, we see, as someone who wrote about Jewishness and became a kind of really important anti-Nazi activist within the scientific community, but then also in his writings about Blackness, we see that he's trying to think about, well, how can we think about both of these populations as needing plasticity for their assimilation and amalgamation, really. And for Blackness, for him, it's like he has a much harder time imagining that plastic imperative and that plastic quality fully realized. And he talks about what he calls the line of cleavage that separates Blackness from whiteness, right? Owing to what he describes as like the kind of irreducible difference of racial form. And so for him, Blackness, like, it's plasticity has to be applied to Blackness. It has to be made plastic, and yet something about it also resists plasticity. And so that's the kind of, I describe it in the book as the racial residuum. And if we go to the 50s, what we see is, the UNESCO 1950 statement is extremely controversial, not least among biologists and geneticists and physical anthropologists, for the way they feel like the social scientists have kind of taken it over and said a bunch of things that they don't agree with, including things like, race should be like, we should stop using the word, it should be expunged from the language. So there's a second statement, the 1951 statement on the nature of race and racial differences, which biologists and geneticists have a stronger hand in formulating. And the rapporteur for that statement, the geneticist L.C. Dunn, has a little preamble where he says, the man on the street knows race when he sees it. If he sees a Black man, an Asian, a Native person walking together, he will see those differences. So like there's this, they fall back ultimately on the idea that there's a kind of common sense visual regime of racial perception, and that you know it when you see it. And so that's what I kind of think about as like this residuum. And the residuum is what plasticity feels like it doesn't quite address, right? Which for Boas is Blackness. For others is sort of Blackness is like especially intractable, but it's also the thing that plasticity has yet to remake. So it's like the remainder and the project that plasticity is going to have to kind of keep working on to make fully mobile.
Do you see in the UNESCO discourse an attempt to kind of have it both ways with the colonial, or do you see it as succumbing to the colonial? How do you understand that tension between an anti-colonial and a colonial impulse towards anti-racism?
Right. Well, so it's certainly an extension of that 19th century kind of, the imperative of colonial educability that we know so well from post-colonial theory, right, has long described that project. And as, other critics have also noted, this is like something that operates not just on the psyches or the intellects of the colonial subject, but also on their biology and flesh. And Deepika Bari, for instance, has made this claim. So we can so in a sense, colonial discourse already knows that not only the minds of colonial subjects, but also potentially their bodies, their fleshly being, has these potentials for being remade, even if, they're intractable or intransigent in some ways. So this certainly perpetuates that, because what it does is it sort of says, well, the educability of the colonial subject now is to kind of submit to the imperatives to be plastic. So when the statement says there are these three categories, but we promise they'll change, to whom is this promise being extended, and to whom is it being extended as a kind of imperative? And that is the project of educability in that moment. What I will say, though, what kind of makes educability complicated and interesting is what changes a little bit in this moment is this kind of abashed recognition that education, so I kind of use Gayatri Spivak's language of soul making, right, which she sort of describes as imperialism's project of trying to create humanity among the colonized, to produce humanity from savagery through the kind of project of soul making. What is really interesting about this moment is that all of a sudden you have all of these European subjects, all of the, the very kind of bureaucratic workings of something like UNESCO that are now really preoccupied with the way that soul making is required in Europe. And so as much as the imperative for the colonized to be educable remains and is extended, and now, sort of understood as this project of plasticity, it is also the case that they kind of recognize, in a sense, what Césaire and Arendt describe as the boomerang effect, where Europe's colonial violence rebounds on itself in the form of Nazism. I think that we can extend that logic and say the colonial educative project now rebounds on Europe. And so you have all of these thinkers who are kind of like, gosh, there's been a kind of trading of places. And what we thought of as the savagery out there is actually the savagery here. And now the project of soul making is required globally, but nowhere more urgently than in Europe itself. What's really interesting about Césaire to me is that, the first edition of Discourse on Colonialism kind of comes out in 1950, and it changes from 1950 to 1955 in some really interesting ways. And I sort of argue in the book, and I won't try to recapitulate the whole back and forth here, that one of the things that's happening is that the shifts we see between the 1950 and 1955 edition and the latter edition, he pays a little bit more attention to the specificity of anti-Semitism and the specificity of the Jewish genocide, right? So in the earlier version, he's thinking a lot about Nazism and fascism and its rebound on Europe, but he's not thinking about Jewishness, and he's not thinking about anti-Semitism per se. It's in the 1955 edition that we actually see him kind of pair anti-Blackness and colonial racism with anti-Semitism, and to kind of link them together. So we see something changing in his own intellectual formation as he tries to think about, how anti-Semitism is racism. And part of what I do in the chapter about Césaire is to kind of reconstruct the way that we can trace these shifts through his debates with Roger Caillois, right, which readers of Discourse on Colonialism know. He has this kind of scathing takedown of Roger Caillois. But what he's really responding to is Caillois' very critical review of Claude Lévi-Strauss's 1952 Race and History, which is the book that Lévi-Strauss writes for UNESCO's race project. So in addition to the 1950 statement and the revision to the statement and the other statements that follow, through the 1950s, UNESCO publishes as part of this race project a series of, I think, very important booklets that try to elaborate on one or another piece of what they describe as the kind of race question in modern science. And Lévi-Strauss's book is the sort of, I think, probably the most influential articulation of cultural relativism. And so Roger Caillois, French sociologist, sort of takes him to task for what he sees as all of the problems of this cultural relativism, and kind of asserts his own sense of European superiority. And it's in his engagement with this debate that Césaire sort of shifts his own position. And so I'm sort of making the argument that it is really as a pedagogical subject of this project that Césaire's own position changes in a way that allows him to kind of better account for the relationship of anti-Semitism and other forms of colonial racism, right? And to begin to link these together as related formations.
Yeah. So that actually backs into the question that I sort of started before but never really pursued, which is this question of like what it means to think of, like, what do bureaucracies actually do in the world? So I actually pulled out this quote from Conrad's Secret Agent, which I always think about, that at one point somebody says to a terrorist, well, if you're a terrorist, then bombs are your means of expression. And I guess I tend to think of governments as like government's means of expression are spending money or deploying armies. Like their speech acts are actually not speech at all. They're the stuff that you do with cash or with weapons. But you're actually saying that the words here are the means of expression. And is it so can you like sort of talk that through about like what, clearly people don't focus too much on the UNESCO bureaucracy when they try to think about like the evolution of post-colonial thinking, about anti-colonialists, the project, but you're arguing for a return to attending to this. So is it, or not even a turn? So is it because of that series of books by people like Lévi-Strauss? Is that the key point, or what's the key? Where does the rubber meet the road, I guess?
I mean, I think the whole project is sort of influential. It's circulating widely. And, if we think about the kind of the declaration as a genre that actually carries a great deal of weight, I think one of the claims I'm making is that we also need to read this 1950 statement, as for its influence on anti-colonial thought, for the ways that it's rooted in this sort of project of Jewish social science and should be understood also as a document of Jewish politics, but then also as a human rights document. And in the meetings where they're trying to decide on its form, they're very consciously drawing on the form of the UDHR.
Yeah.
And so as much as these documents are, we could say bureaucratic documents, I think they're also culturally influential documents. And I think there's been a lot of work done in literary studies on, say, the UDHR, for instance, as a document that has this sort of wide cultural influence. One chapter of the book is really thinking about Frantz Fanon as someone who I'm arguing has this sort of dialogue going with the statement, with, anti-racism, because I think we're used to thinking about people like Césaire and Fanon as these like really trenchant critics of metropolitan racism. But I think what I'm trying to suggest here is if we look for the ways that it feels like the UNESCO project is also a kind of object of interest for them, they're also critics of anti-racism and these there are different genres of anti-racism.
Right.
And so they're sort of intervening. And I think we could read aspects of Fanon's argument in Black Skin, White Masks as engaging very critically with the idea of plasticity.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? Because I know that's an important part of your book.
Yeah. So in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon has these like pretty famous statements that he makes about Jewishness, on the one hand, at various moments sort of claiming a kinship with Jewishness and his own Blackness, right? That they're united in their sort of shared struggle and their suffering, that violations of the rights of Jews are violations of his own rights, he says. So there's this assumption of kinship that some critics have been really eager to pick up on and sort of say, like, okay, how does this give us a history of solidarity? There are also these places that critics have read, in some cases with a little bit more trepidation and a little bit more resistance, where he says, the Jew is a white man and the Holocaust is a family quarrel, is basically how he puts it, and sort of contrast that to his own Blackness. And so people have read that in different ways, right? As he's sort of asserting just like a truth. Some critics have wanted to read that claim at face value. Others have said, whoa, this is like scathing and critical, but it's kind of missing some of the complexities of the situation. So what I'm trying to do is to suggest, if we think about what he's saying, not as these like enduring ahistorical claims about the truth of Jewish whiteness, but instead try to read them in their historical context alongside these social scientific reworkings of race that are happening at that moment. Does that maybe offer us a different reading? And so in the chapter, I'm trying to think a little bit about the way that if we read his comments on the Holocaust as a family quarrel alongside, say, Boaz's assertions about Jewish plasticity and its kind of paradigmatic plasticity and capacity for assimilation, do we arrive at a different reading? Do we arrive at a different reading where part of what Fanon's thinking about in this moment, where, that race is being described as plastic and plasticity is an imperative, the imperative to change, which he recognizes as not just a product of a long colonial history, but as something that is still happening in the present and being reasserted in the present, even at this moment that we're supposed to be, confronted with the arrival of like a new human that is properly universal this time. And he's sort of saying, like, no, that's not the case. Blackness is still defined by these strictures of racial taxonomy. And this is what we see, for instance, in what I was describing as Dunn's assertion of that visual regime, right? Like, we know it when we see it. And this is really, in a way, what Fanon's writing about in that famous 5th chapter in the lived experience of the Black, where it's all about that assertion of like the supposed common senseness of the visual perception of race and what that means, what that precludes for the Black subject. First of all, any capacity to participate in natality, like the capacity for new beginnings that aren't already defined in advance by the script of racial determination.
Yeah.
So that's what that chapter is trying to do. So as much as I'm arguing in that chapter that Fanon's reading plasticity critically, and so is like kind of deeply critically engaged with UNESCO's project, we could look to someone like Césaire, who is also critically engaging with UNESCO, and in some of his other writing specifically singles out UNESCO to say, these fantasies UNESCO has that you can kind of put the culture of the colonized back together are like these fantasies of repair and reparation that are not borne out in this neo-colonial order. At the same time, he's also engaging with UNESCO's race project, and as I suggested, is kind of learning from it in an interesting way.
Yeah.
So
Actually,
these are some of the ways that we can map, what these connections look like in actuality.
Yeah, that's totally great. And that really helps like put more, like part of what I love about the book is the density of that notion of the kind of implicit conversations, even at the moment that explicit conversations get marked, but that there are these implicit entanglements as well. But speaking of entanglements, since you did mention natality, I'd love to talk more about that, because that's actually the formulation you just gave is really helpful. Like in the book, one formulation I see you offer of it is that in using natality, you suggest that Arendt is maybe kind of falling into a discourse of plasticity that is circumscribed in ways that she doesn't necessarily admit. But here I hear you using it in slightly a different sense, like it's a capacity which is of value, and yet it's also implicitly exclusionary. Is that right? Or
yes. Okay. Well, let me just rephrase that a little bit. So here's the way that, like, I think part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to situate this UNESCO project with natality as one of the organizing terms. And part of what, in that moment of like rupture and renewal in that early post-war period, what I see in the UNESCO discourse is this deep concern with how do we produce newness in this world where we're not sure if we should be preserving and putting together the old. Like on the one hand, here's this organization dedicated to cultural preservation and transmission, but they're also kind of like, man, the values are so tainted, What do we do with that? And can we actually create something new? Or is that past inheritance so overweening that it actually precludes the capacity for real natality, with like that problem of racism as inherited form, of race as inherited form, and racism as sort of like this inherited hate that we maybe can't get behind, precluding that capacity for newness. And I think this is something that Arendt recognizes herself about natality, that as much as she sort of singles out natality as this like profoundly important capacity for the making of human political communities, she sort of recognizes, she says at one point, there's always the likelihood that tomorrow is the same as yesterday. I'm mangling this a little bit, but she sort of recognizes that the likelihood that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday is far greater than we might want to imagine.
Yeah.
The theorist Education, Natasha Levinson, describes this as the paradox of natality in the midst of belatedness. So this idea that however much we might aim ourselves towards the natal and its promise of newness, we're always doing so against the pull of the past and the pull of the familiar, and that this is actually a kind of overweening force in many respects. And so this is, I'm sort of arguing, what UNESCO's thinkers take up as a kind of problem that is embedded in the very structure of race and racism.
Okay, so that's really great. That helps me formulate the question that I kind of wanted to come back to, is that I began by sort of asserting that this is like this pre-curdled moment or liquefied moment or something, and then things curdle. And so I guess the question is, if we think about this as a space of possibility, when things curdle again, whether that's with the second UNESCO statement or whenever it is, do they curdle back to just kind of the old forms because this is belatedness? Or is it more like this is a liquid moment, then there's these new formulations are offered, and then they in their turn become old and ossified? Do you see what I mean? Like, is it more like the return of the thing that was momentarily seemed like it might be displaced, but it kind of comes back? Or is it more like, no, we just have a hardening of whatever new thing we did?
Yeah, and I think the new thing is tainted from the outset. Right. I think that's the important thing. And that, the way I describe it in the book is that these concepts that they're trying to mobilize to respond to this moment of opening. So there's like a real moment of opening. There is a real moment where these like tectonic shifts are taking place. The opening is real. What they choose to fill that opening with, and I think is like already compromised set of concepts, right? So that like the very notion of plasticity is this way, like at the conceptual level, it's trying to manage and ameliorate these tensions between, on the one hand, okay, we're anti-racist now, but actually we'd still like to hold on to our empires, right? Like, so from the very beginning, the concepts that they're using are the ones that they think will help them thread this needle or square this circle. And of course they don't. So they're flawed from the outset is how I would put it.
So I totally get get that, but how do you just let me torque it slightly differently. If I understand Foucault, how Foucault uses the concept of genealogy, part of the problem with genealogy is not that there's no such thing as novelty in the world. It's that all of the novelty in the world arises on an antecedent residuum. So yeah, of course you mobilize the pre-extant categories. That's a given. You don't have any other categories. But then once the tectonic plates have shifted, when you mobilize them, they then do something different. In other words, in every moment of tectonic shift, you're building up new volcanoes or whatever, new layers of rock, but they are new. And then they in turn go on to have their own results. I mean, that's how I understand Foucault's point about genealogy, that it's not like we're trapped in eternal return. It's just that we're trapped we only have the tools that we have from the past.
Right. Well, I think this is where it matters that this sort of contrapuntal reading comes into play, that we have to look at the way that, the anti-colonial thinkers I turn to, for instance, Fanon, Césaire, but also people later on like Ama Ata-Adu, who's, writing in the 70s in this wonderfully scathing and ironic way about Europe's claims to still be asserting, what a humanist education grounded on the memory of the Holocaust is.
Yeah.
That where that difference comes in is in the way that these thinkers take up these concepts and sort of reflect them back in a somewhat changed way, right? In a way that either shows up their contradictions or ironizes them or puts them to new purposes. Among those purposes that I think, what is generative, and the kind of note also on which the book ends is with thinking about what Césaire manages to accomplish, the way that he takes the kind of pedagogical operations of this project and finds in it something new and important for his own intellectual formation, which is to kind of make these tighter connections between anti-Semitism and various colonial racisms. Yeah. So I think that's where the differences are. It's when we look at it in a kind of contrapuntal perspective that we begin to see how the categories and the concepts can be put to new uses or be turned against themselves and, made to mean something a little bit different.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. And so that leads me to sort of, as we make our final turn towards home, I guess, this sort of maybe brings us to this question of how you would connect the thinking you're doing in this book for the post-war period to currents in the present. I thought, if we had time, we could also talk about post-1989. That might be an interesting moment. But I mean, here we are in 2023. So I just wondered, how there must be so many ways you can take it. How are you thinking about its relevance to the present?
Well, so, the coda of the book is called The Waning Consensus, and it was written a little more than a year ago, last fall. And in the coda, I'm sort of reflecting on how do we think about this mid-century moment of possibility and openness? Because from the perspective of the present, what they did in 1950 seems like a historical oddity, right? An artifact from another time where they really believed, however misguidedly, that they could sit down and formulate a new understanding of race that would sort of have this globally transformative effect on people's psyches, on their sort of spiritual and moral formation. That does not seem possible today. And their conviction that, they could in some way really re-educate racism in the sense also feels like an artifact from another time. And I think, that part of the interest of the statement to me is that it really canonized that the liberal anti-racist consensus that has in some form or another prevailed for so many years, right, has kind of had the status of a certain kind of common sense, even as it's been resisted in various ways. And certainly the resistance to that liberal anti-racism, which is deeply, deeply problematic and flawed, and it has been resisted precisely because it doesn't answer the real questions that we care about, right? If race doesn't exist, if race is meaningless, how does it still organize our social world and the possibilities for thriving and so on? But what we see in our current moment is really the rise of various kinds of global new rights that have, I think, really undone that consensus. And there's nothing with which to answer it. I don't think the kind of liberal anti-racism has good rejoinders to those questions. But the other thing that I try to say in the coda is that what we really see in our moment is the way that anti-Semitism, the struggle against anti-Semitism, as we see in Fanon and Césaire, was really linked to the struggle against other kinds of racisms in this moment. And that's what's so poignant about Césaire's recognition in the 1955 edition. We see that coming undone. And when I wrote that a year ago, I was not thinking about, the accelerated version of that we're seeing in our own moment with the war on Gaza right now, and the ways that accusations around anti-Semitism have been weaponized, have been turned on their head. I write in the coda of the book about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which was issued in 2016, which has been, adopted by educational institutions, governments, various kinds of civil society organizations, which has been hugely problematic for the way that it suggests that criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. And, there has been organized pressure on that definition precisely for the ways that it shuts down those kinds of questions, including an alternative definition of anti-Semitism, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Yes, exactly. But what we're seeing now is the way that delinking, because as I say in the book, the risk of that is that it uncouples anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism from a broader struggle against racism. And I think when you lose that connection, when you make, leftists and Palestinian liberation movements and student protesters the sort of figures for anti-Semitism in our moment, I think something very dangerous has happened, and that we actually lose sight of what anti-Semitism is and where it tends to come from and how to fight it effectively, which is in a kind of coalitional way and in solidarity with these other movements. So when, we see like Trump Republicans, far hard right figures becoming the arbiters of what anti-Semitism is and isn't, and up is down and down is up. I think we're in a really, really terrifying moment where we kind of are losing our sense of what anti-Semitism is and how we might actually struggle against it.
So the final turn for home then, Sonali, for today's conversation is to ask you about a recallable book, which is, as you remember, it's the section in which a guest suggests something that people might wish to read if they have enjoyed this conversation. So do you have one for us?
Yes. So I would say my recallable book, and I hope this isn't too obvious, perhaps all the listeners of this show know this book well, would be M. Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism.
That sounds
great. Which feels
to
me like a crucial book for this moment. I'm going to be teaching an Intro to Postcolonial Studies class next semester. I plan to start with that as a way to help my students understand the moment that we're in. So I recommend it highly, especially now more than ever.
I'm going to ask a super nerdy question, since I'm not really a Francophone person. Is the translation, the common translation, the second edition or the first? Like, is it the 1950 or the 55?
It's the second. Yeah, it's the 1955 edition. The 1955 edition is the one we have today in Joan Pinkham's translation.
Awesome. Okay. And so mine actually, after all, like apropos of your point about the space between Zionism and opposition to Zionism or opposition to criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, is that I just taught George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, like during this war moment. And, wonderful, poignant book called Her Jewish Novel, a novel about like the notion of kind of anchoring Jewishness in an imagined homeland somewhere amorphously in the East. And, my students, because they were tuned in to the fact of the war, really fixated on that question of like whether Eliot thought she had solved the quote national question of the Jew by proposing like a homeland. And it's so poignant now to look back, because it's not to accuse Eliot herself of a kind of inadequate philo-Semitism or something, but just to see that how the categories of like grounding cultural belonging in a nation state, which seemed to her to present like some opportunity to do an end run around anti-Semitism, in fact, in many ways just tend to, as you said, deepen and worsen these sort of political conflagration around the question of what it means to criticize a Jewish state, to criticize the Jewishness of a state. And so it's just poignant to read Daniel Deronda in that moment. So anyway, thank you so much for your time with us today, Sonali.
It's been a pleasure.
It's really a wonderful book, and I really hope it will spark many more conversations. And I think you're probably starting lots of yet younger scholars out on this topic as well. So if you enjoyed this, I would just say please do check out earlier Recall This Book episodes, not just the Violent Majorities and the Duran Wallace episode I mentioned earlier, but our conversation, for example, with David Cunningham on racialized policing, or on Joshua Cohen with his novel The Netanyahus, or also, Sonali, I don't know if you knew this, but we talked to Carol Phillips himself back in 2022. So there's a Carol Phillips connection in Sonali's book and in Recall This Book as well. So to all of you out there, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye for now. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.